Welcome to Byrna's Hot Take, where we discuss self-defense, tactics, tips, and training so that if the time comes, you are prepared to defend. Welcome to another episode, Byrna Nation. Today, I have a very special guest today. Ryan is with us to really kind of talk about a very different segment of self-defense that we don't get an opportunity to really kind of explore a lot. Ryan has been a professional captain and a professional, sailor for over 2 decades now. He's been a professional captain for, more than 15 years. Has done everything from working on super yachts to instructional sailing, and then also racing on the U.S. national sailboat team. So when it comes to, maritime, he's definitely the expert. But, definitely recently being living on the water, he's really taken a very proactive stance on his personal safety, while on the boat and while on the water. And he's starting to impart that to other people as well through training and educational programs. And Ryan has been, introduced to the Byrna product and has started to incorporate Byrna's products into that defense strategy. So, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is fun.
Yeah. So I try to give a quick introduction, of you, but I'm doing you a disservice, I'm sure. Give us a little bit of your background, especially when it comes to kind of the maritime portion of what you've been doing, both professionally and then educationally in that arena.
Sure. I've been sailing my whole life. When I was a little kid, going out with my father, he was a racer, and I would sit on the rail and every once in a while pull a rope when he would tell me to. Once I got into college, as a sort of a side job, I was teaching sailing at this facility in San Diego. And that led to me teaching at sort of a little bit more high performance based sailing school. I was an adjunct professor of sailing at San Diego State University, where people actually took semester long courses in sailing for credit, which was a lot of fun.
That's going to be the best college course ever.
You actually taught surfing also, believe it or not. It was a fun school. Anyways, from there, I transitioned into working on some race boats and also some super yachts. Starting off deckhand, worked my way up to mate, and eventually was captain of a large luxury sailing yacht out of San Diego. And at the same time, I was racing on the U.S. national team and transitioned from there into cruising. Got a boat ready, a little 38-foot monohull. And then about 10 years ago, my wife and I sailed that boat from San Diego down to Mexico and then across the Pacific with one friend to the South Pacific, where we've been ever since.
That's so cool. So what, so you've got your hands in a lot when it comes to when it comes to what you're doing kind of on a daily basis. Most recently, what are some of the things that you're involved in now that you're living over in Tahiti most of the time, spending your time over there?
Oh, wow. It's a big mix of things. I think it's, we were talking earlier, it's sort of maybe more of the modern style of work where you're specialized in lots of areas. But most recently, we've actually, a large source of our income comes from our YouTube channel, To Afloat Sailing. We also manage a rental property back home in San Diego. And from a sailing perspective, I get contracted occasionally to go out and work on sort of special projects. But primarily these days it's sailing and sharing the story and sort of sharing the joys and the challenges and the whole spectrum that is sailing in areas as remote as the islands of Tahiti.
So your YouTube channel, that's To Afloat Sailing, right?
Yes.
What are what's kind of the main focus of that channel? Like if you go over to the channel and watch, what are you really trying to focus on that content that you're putting out?
It's evolving. It's constantly changing. Initially it was I tried to actually like make little films of around themes based on life of cruising in the South Pacific. Over time, it sort of was too much for me to run the boat and run the channel and everything. And my wife, Nicole, started taking over more of the editing. And she took it more of a like, let's share what we're doing sort of approach, peppered with our usual immature, not safe for work sort of humor, and content. And it's evolved. And now we also include a lot of informative videos. We're about to release a series of videos on self-defense. We've done ones on medical emergencies. I have 10 years on an advanced life support ambulance in the city of San Diego. Wife and I are both EMTs, and she was an ocean lifeguard in the city of San Diego. I've gone through the academy and did the other stuff. So anyways, we share a lot of information about, if somebody falls overboard, how do you fight fires on board? How do you handle medical emergencies? And then now a big focus on self-defense.
That's so cool. You get a lot of, that lifestyle, stuff, which is so awesome, especially in a place, where you're at. But the education, to me, the educational stuff, that's where I really love to go and see that, because once again, you're coming from such a different perspective, and a lot of times from a different background. I think that's so great that you guys are putting that information out and sharing your experiences from people that do it, literally full time all the time. So that's super cool. So, what really got you taking a more proactive, stance in self-defense? Because I think a lot of people, cruisers or boaters alike, part-time boaters or people that are doing it all the time, or people that are going to, embark on a bigger journey. I think that there's this general misconception, unfortunately, that, hey, it's every day's a vacation and every day is just, it's I'm out there, I'm always gonna be having a good time, drinking Bellinis on the bow, and that's just how it is 24/7. Really, what experiences did you have, and really what got you thinking that, hey, we need to take a little bit more proactive stance on our defense plan here?
I'm gonna have to look up Bellini after the podcast. That sounds interesting.
I think it's like some sparkling wine and some, I don't know. There's different types. But.
Okay, got it. To answer your question, as a professional sailor, especially when I was working as a captain on the larger yachts and when I was teaching sailing, and then with my background on the ambulance, you do a lot of time training for stuff that doesn't happen very often. So you're sort of preparing for situations and then not worrying about them. You're not being paranoid. You're being prepared, not paranoid.
We used to call those high risk, low frequency events.
I love that.
Yeah, I mean that's what you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, 95% of your time is high risk, low frequency events. So
100%. But it also keeps you proficient in all the ancillary stuff. But with sailing, a lot of people, when they're getting ready to do real cruising, not just, even if they're just sailing around coastally, everyone is at their level of comfort and their level of proficiency, and cruisers tend to always sort of push it just a little bit and sort of step to the next level, and that's the adventure of it, And when as you go through that journey, at some point, you start with, how do you sail the boat, how do you adjust the sails and so forth, and then you learn, what do you do if somebody falls overboard, what do you do if the wind gets too strong, how do you make the boat safe in these new, more radical conditions of sailing. And eventually, if you progress from there, you get to the point where you're talking about, what do you do if the boat sinks? How do you deploy a life raft? How do you fight a fire? How do you prevent the fire in the first place? How do you survive more significant weather? So there's all this sort of safety stuff and the ancillary stuff, like operating communications gear, operating safety equipment, mental state, how do you maintain your health? All of these things that go into operating safely in these more remote, more or less rescue certain environments. And the one area that is traditionally very neglected in the sort of cruising, genre of study, is self-defense. When you go to online, you'll find some discussion about self-defense, but usually it's more of an argument about, should you have guns or not have guns? Or there'll be like a little cursory discussion about, well, you can use your flare gun as a gun, and then there'll be 5 pages of arguments about whether that works or not. I'll use my spear gun, and then 5 pages of arguments about that. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to do the homework. I've got the background and I've got the contacts, and I think the perspective and experience to look at this from a public safety standpoint, from a sailing standpoint, from a teaching standpoint, and compile it all together and hopefully simplify it in a way that can be easily deployed by the widest range of cruisers in terms of age, ability, location, access to equipment, other resources, etc. And hopefully make a big difference. There's many thousands of cruisers sailing around the world in all different areas every year. And of that, there's probably only in the hundreds of cruisers who face a self-defense incident. But it's way more than the number of cruisers that are facing a sinking boat or a vessel fire, something like that. And yet, we all have life rafts. We all have fire extinguishers. We all read about that stuff and studied it. It's in all the books. So it makes sense to me, just like you have a life raft and you do a man overboard drills, you should have some basic self-defense equipment, and you should have some understanding of how to deploy it and how to prevent it needing to be deployed in the first place.
That's such a great analogy, on the water. We always say, especially in the, the active shooter world and doing all the active shooter training that I've done over my career, we always talk about fires as well. Look at schools, look at public buildings that are required to have fire drills every, 6 months or quarter, whatever it is, and all the education that goes with that. Every kid that grew up past like 1960 knows what to do when you catch fire. What do you do? Like if I'm on fire, I stop, drop, and roll, right? Everybody knows that. But nobody's catching on fire. Like it just doesn't happen, right. But yet, like you said, there's so much emphasis on that training. There's so much emphasis on that prevention and that education. But yet it doesn't ever, statistically it's very unlikely to happen. Now, I think there's two possibilities from that. And one, we're in a technological state where that just is unlikely to happen, or because we're harping on training, it's unlikely to happen because you're doing the right things, you're taking the right steps to make sure that it's not happening. So either way, it's working. Either way, what we're doing is working. So to your merit, and like you said, why wouldn't we take something that is much more statistically likely to happen to you and give it the same amount of concern, the same amount of attention and education and training, so that we make it like fires where there's so much, less statistically
100%.
possible.
In cruising, there's another element as well, and that is, cruising, it's way more work than people imagine, but there are aspects of it that are enjoyable. And when you have that peace of mind, knowing that you're prepared, it, I think, makes the cruising even that much more enjoyable. You're not sort of as much on edge. Frankly, from a self-defense perspective, a lot of the preparation is actually kind of fun, so it's kind of you kind of win in all realms.
I love it. So were there any specific things? Obviously, you've been doing this for a long time. How long have you been I guess living on the water as kind of your primary residence, so to speak?
Yeah, I've been living on the water full time for almost 12 years.
Wow, that is awesome.
On board a vessel, but a year of that was on a luxury super yacht, so that doesn't really count.
Still living on the water. Still on the water.
It's still living on the water. That's right.
But
we've been underway full time for almost 10 years now.
Wow,
with most of that being in the South Pacific and Mexico.
That's so cool. So in that 10, 12, plus years, or even before that, how many times have you encountered a situation where, your safety was, I don't want to say compromised, but your safety was at risk? Somebody was either trying to get on the boat or trying to break in the boat, or you felt like, man, this could turn south really quick.
Yeah, from a self-defense standpoint, I would say, it kind of depends on where we are, but multiple times per month, at least. And oftentimes it's very low in severity. It'll be like a theft risk, or risk of an unfavorable interaction with an inhabitant, something like this, or a dog, like a stray dog, or we've personally been boarded twice that we know of and had stuff stolen. I would say it's almost while we're on the boat, at night. It's almost a weekly occurrence that we hear of somebody who had the engine of their dinghy stolen, their little boat that takes them to shore, or a fishing rod stolen off deck, or some dive gear that they left out to dry. And then oftentimes it's just opportunistic. Somebody is just kind of cruising by in their canoe and they go, that looks nice, and they go on board and they take it.
Wow, that's so much more frequent than I would have imagined, and I can imagine most people would probably imagine. That's definitely something that you need to be proactive about.
100%. And fortunately, it's also something that's relatively easy to prevent. You don't leave your fishing gear out, it doesn't get stolen. But there are also, I would say, multiple times per year, even in just the islands of French Polynesia where we are now, there's stories of forced entry. Most often in near marinas and the sort of the more populated areas, but also in the more remote areas. There's some areas of French Polynesia where methamphetamine is starting to become a problem. And there's other areas where I think that they see these really nice boats and they go, hey, I want some of that. And you're out diving or you're out surfing or doing whatever it is you're doing. And they'll come in just, a lot of people leave their boat wide open, but other times it'll be locked up and they'll come with a crowbar and break it in. That's the most common. And that's the most common by far. Dinghy theft, engine theft, fishing gear, dive gear, and a little bit of forced entry. But there's also, we know of a handful of people, all women, unfortunately, who have been raped in French Polynesia. We know of 2 murders. All of these during the time that we've been there. We've personally been charged by dogs, I don't even know how many times. 9 times out of 10, you puff up, you make some noise, the dog kind of hesitates, but we know of people who've been bitten since we've been there. We know of a couple who, a very popular, famous cruising couple that we actually got to spend a month with, so we're sort of friends with them, but they were attacked by monkeys, not in French Polynesia. My wife
that's terrifying.
It's terrifying. It was, it almost got one of his kids, actually. My wife was working on the deck of the boat once at anchor, and a man paddled up in his canoe and started masturbating in broad daylight. And when I went up and sort of confronted him verbally, he raised a spear gun, sort of.
These are all new problems that I have not really thought through, right? And now my brain is just reeling of like, oh my God, these are all new issues that I need to address. What if this happens? But just that example right there, even this petty theft stuff, where somebody's going to come on board your boat just to steal, whatever it is off of the the transom or something like that might be sitting there. Like, that encounter can go south fast. Even if it's
exactly,
if it starts as a, hey, I'm just trying to crime of opportunity, I'm just trying to grab this thing, but then all of a sudden, now you're confronted. And now you're confronting them, and man, and all of a sudden he's got a spear gun pointed at you. That's
100%.
That's to me is even more terrifying than some of the other stuff that you just don't know. You have no idea how that's going to go.
And even if it's not necessarily life-threatening, like to the degree of a spear gun, you still don't feel like getting beaten up anywhere, much less on your own boat. It can even be dangerous when you're in remote areas where you don't have access to medical attention. And frankly, I don't necessarily think you want to be beating up people on your boat.
Sure.
Sure. You want them to leave your boat or not get there in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
So kind of to transition into that, when it comes to your self-defense plan, you've done a great job of making it very simple and easy to understand, and really very simple to apply for a lot of boaters and cruisers out there. And I think the first step of that was by really delineating, kind of these threat levels, saying, hey, look, this is how we look at, this threat, and this is how we look at, and it's all based on proximity. It's based on, behavior, of the individual. But the reason I loved it so much was really because you said, look, this threat level is associated with this kind of response, and so if you can just, really kind of associate that to yourself as like, hey, if they're doing this, this is how I need to respond. It makes it very easy to understand, very easy to remember, and then something that you can apply, without having to think about things too much.
Yeah, gladly. Thank you. And thank you for reading that over. You and a number of other experienced cruisers, captains, and even some law enforcement friends of mine in law enforcement reviewed it. And I'm putting that whole document on last night. I actually bought the website, cruisersafety.info. So it'll be available to anybody with links to the Byrna products, especially, that I think are most relevant. But to answer your question, the way I approach self-defense, and this is mostly from the perspective of a vessel at anchor, which is where cruisers spend the vast majority of the time, and where the vast majority of self-defense situations occur, other than on land. There's tons of information about land that's sort of the same almost anywhere you go. But when you're at anchor, I look at it like you as zones, sort of levels. The furthest away zone is absolutely no threat present at all, nothing detectable, and that's sort of the potential threat. And for each of these zones, I should say, there's detection and there's deterrence. So for this zone where there's no threat that's detectable, you're trying to prevent sort of the temptation from becoming a target. You're not trying to look tough and hard and, don't mess with me, but you're trying to say nothing interesting here for you to take. And by the way, it might not be the easiest thing. So you're closing the gates on your lifelines. You're pulling up your boarding ladder. You're lifting up your dinghy at night. You're taking valuable gear off the decks when you go to bed or when you're off the boat. You're not leaving computers and cell phones and things all over the cabin. You're making friends with locals. You're making friends with the other cruisers and the boats that are around you. You're sort of building a network, getting a feel for what the local sort of level of threat will be. You're doing your homework. There's oftentimes a lot of written information and blogs and other cruiser resources about the history of threats in the area, the pattern of threats, and you're sort of preparing yourself accordingly. So that I call zone 5 or level 5. The next closest level would be a threat that is in visual or detectable range, but not yet audible range. So this would be maybe you're getting cased, like a vessel, like oftentimes, and we saw this a lot in Mexico, and a boat would sort of be just kind of on the range of where you might be able to communicate, but they're staring intently. And I've actually a few times lifted binoculars and saw binoculars being looking back at me. I think this is an important point to make, and I'm hopefully going to make it a few times throughout our conversation. Most people are thinking of self-defense cruisers, and they immediately think pirates, like armed people coming on board and holding you at gunpoint. And that's what you hear about, because those are the ones they get on CNN, and those are the scary ones. They're also the most, by orders of magnitude, least common circumstances, and generally tend to be in the same known regions. The smaller scale piracy, which is similar to like an armed intruder in a home or something like that, that happens in Central America, Mexico, but rare. I don't personally know anybody who's experienced any kind of armed aggression, but when it happens, it's very loud. Everybody hears about it, so everybody freaks out. It's kind of like sharks. There's a shark attack once in a while, and everyone goes, "Oh my gosh, sharks are the big threat in the ocean," but way more people get in trouble from a myriad of other things in the ocean that can potentially be dangerous. So armed conflict is real. I think it's something that should be paid attention to, potentially even prepared for to a level, but it's also by far the least likely threat that a cruiser is to face. So when you're talking about somebody in this next zone, this zone 4, where they're in visual range, uh, obviously early detection is key. The earlier that you can detect a threat, the more options you have, and especially the more options that are low levels of intensity and aggression you have to sort of mitigate this threat or handle it. The whole idea is to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your property in the least aggressive way possible. Let's not elevate. That's how I look at self-defense. This isn't about teaching a lesson. This isn't about capturing somebody for the authorities or something like this. This is about protection, and that's largely about prevention. So early detection is key. So one thing you can do is set guard alarms on your radar if you have the power for that. You can maintain a visual watch if you're in an area where there's a known area of higher threat. If you have other boats in the same anchorage, you can even take turns doing that so it doesn't interfere with your sleep and things like this. That's in a higher risk area. In a lower risk area, generally, I just don't leave the temptation. It's the same like we talked about the potential threat that nothing detectable. But when they are in this visual range, now you have a chance to assess. So you can, take your binoculars, take a quick look. Are they casing you out? Are they kind of looking at you? Or do they have fishing gear and they're just fishing and happen to be in visual range, which is 99.9% of the time. When you wave, do they wave back friendly? You can get kind of a rough idea, and oftentimes your gut will kind of your gut will kind of guide you a little bit into this range. So then the next step closer is when they're in verbal range. Now you can do a much more thorough assessment. They're certainly close enough now that you can say, "Hey, how's it going?" and get some idea of their response. With binoculars especially, you can better get an idea of what equipment they have on them. If they're wearing just a pair of like board shorts, trunks, barefoot, no shirt, no bags, nothing in their canoe, pretty good chance they're not, carrying a firearm or something or something like this. But maybe they have a spear gun, maybe they have a machete, maybe they don't have any of that stuff. Can you get an idea of their demeanor? Are they kind of sort of twitchy and agitated, or are they relaxed and laid back? Are they drinking? Because that can lead to a change in behavior over time. Or can even lead to irrational response right away. Are they coming sort of towards you with some sort of intent, or are they sort of happen to be in the area, but they're doing something else, swimming with their kid or fishing oftentimes. You can start doing a little bit better assessment, but you can also start doing a little bit more deterrence as well. If you don't like the way the situation is unfolding, now you have an opportunity to say, hey man, what's going on? Like, everything okay? Are we good? Hopefully you speak the language. But if not, you can just go like, hey, I'm cool. That's good. Don't stay where you are. Don't come any closer.
Yeah. Do you find that, have you had some situations where, because we talk a lot about, about that, being proactive about looking at people, making eye contact, and kind of that verbal challenge, and how that's can sometimes be one of the biggest deterrents, because people are looking for a weak target. They're looking for people that aren't paying attention. They're looking for people that aren't situational aware. Have you come across occasions where, you were real uneasy and it looks like this guy had some intentions, and just that verbal challenge was kind of able to kind of move him on to maybe the next target?
Yes. Frankly, we were not, let's say, deploying an adequate level of sort of self-defense strategy up until recently. And that's why we were boarded a few times and had things taken. Nicole, my wife, woke up. She saw some lights, kind of half awake. We didn't have a self-defense plan. We had very basics. We had some pepper spray and a machete. And okay, if somebody comes, show them who's boss. That was our plan. So anyways, she actually walks out into the cockpit of the boat and was facing a man armed with a spear gun. This is like 3 a.m, something like that, standing on the boat facing her, wearing all black, a wetsuit. Well, it turns out in this case, it was a man whose canoe had drifted away while he was spearfishing at night. And our boat happened to be the closest thing. So he came aboard, and it turned out to be, she called for me. I came on deck, also just burst out on deck, in a pair of trunks. And it turned out to not be a big deal. But we had to say to him at some point, what are you doing here? And if we had gone, hey, get off my boat, that would have gone potentially differently than, can I help you? What's going on? Now, we were fortunate. He had good, okay intentions. It wasn't a problem. If he didn't, we weren't prepared. That was sailing without a life raft, and the boat taking on some water. So the verbal challenge is important, but I think you also need to be prepared for a higher level of deterrence at that point, because once you're at anchor, it's sort of flipped from land. When you're on land and you can, I don't want to say wait until you have a threat on top of you. Obviously, situational awareness is critical, like walking back to your car after you shop, whatever it is, walking into your house, or the doors open, whatever it is. But on land, you can deploy sort of closer proximity stuff, like a pepper spray in the face, a bad guy spray, something like this. And then if you read the instructions in any of those, they say run. But when you're on a boat, you can't escape.
There's nowhere to go.
There's nowhere to go.
Yeah,
I guess you could swim.
I'd never thought about it that way, because we always teach that, right? Escape. Like, look, you're trying to protect yourself. You're using, means of self-defense. You're using intermediate weapons in order to give yourself a window to get out, But you're absolutely right. There's just, there's nowhere to go.
So it's critically important that you prevent a threat from getting on board your boat. So this level, when they're approaching and you're in verbal range, this is sort of almost your last chance to do that in a very passive way, but not the last chance, because the next level is where they're actually contacting your boat, and potentially boarding the boat. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they're a threat. Very oftentimes, you'll see a boat coming towards you, and you'll see maybe a spear gun in there and some stuff, and maybe there's 2 or 3 people in the boat, and you're not sure, and you wave, and they wave, and you're kind of a little bit not sure. And then they get closer, and they hold up a fish, and hey, you hungry? Or would you like to buy the fish? Most of the time, they'll give it to you. Um, almost always, I would say. Like, this isn't about being paranoid and terrified of people. But if they are a potential threat, if they don't mean well, or if they're using the fish as sort of a Trojan horse offering, this is your last chance. So this is where you want to start being prepared to keep them from getting on your boat. And in my opinion, this is where Byrna is the almost only device that addresses this threshold between potential threat becoming actual threat, especially for cruisers at anchor. And that's because you could, for example, wear a Byrna pistol and a fanny pack. I like the waist pack especially, because you might be wearing that when you're on your boat. The sling bag is more like around town. But you have that on. You're not a threat. You're not elevating. It's super important that you don't like puff up and pull out an actual firearm or a spear gun and you're like, hey, what are you doing, man? Like, the idea is to not escalate. The idea is to not have them assume an aggressive posture to match your aggressive posture. Be friendly. Hey, how's it going? But if you have this Byrna launcher loaded, potentially with some kinetic and some pepper max rounds, if they start to actually come aboard the boat and you're like, hey, don't come on the boat, and they're still coming on the boat, you can make the decision to deploy this. It's infinitely better than shooting a spear gun, a flare gun, or an actual firearm or something like this. These are mistakes you can't take back.
I haven't done a whole lot of spearfishing, and by a whole lot, I mean none. But I can imagine that, a spear gun inside of 30 feet is probably deadly. Like, I would imagine that's a lethal weapon. And same with a flare gun. I mean, you're shooting a literal ball of fire at someone's face. I mean, that could very potentially be lethal. And so at that point, like you said, you're really just better off having a gun if you're going to use that, because all of them are lethal weapons.
100%. And flare guns, it's one of those topics of discussion, let's say, in the cruising community. I think people like to make themselves feel good because they have flare guns and they can launch them. And maybe if you have no other option, it might be a deterrent. But I encourage people to go to a remote area and actually try shooting these things with any degree of accuracy, without disparaging the people who are really into their self-defense by flare gun. Let's just say there are other options that may be more effective. A spear gun, when you fire that, again, you get one shot. It's hard to load quickly. If you leave it loaded, it loses its power because the bands sort of become stretched. The spear itself is usually attached to the spear gun by a piece of wire that causes it oftentimes to snap back, and a lot of injuries, even underwater. It's designed to be fired in a very thick medium. When you fire it at land, it's dangerous. Anyone who's an experienced at spearfishing knows you don't fire spear guns at land. It's just like something you don't do because of the danger. So look, you have no other options. You haven't done any preparation. Is it better than nothing? Marginally. But if you have the option, look, if it's a life or death, the person's armed, and you decide that you want to engage, especially if they're engaged with a gun, you need a gun, in my opinion. Or you need nothing and just like, I'm a passive, very low threat, take my stuff, please don't kill me. But if they're not armed, which is 99.9, or if they're armed with, like a machete or something like this, don't let them get close enough to be a threat. And that's where Byrnas come in, that nothing else really is anywhere close to as effective. if they're trying to get aboard your boat and they have a machete and you've assessed them to be a definite threat, you're going to change their mind if you get a max round on them or even a max round near them. My personal opinion is that you should not use chemical rounds once they are on the boat if you can avoid it.
Because there's nowhere
I think
for you
you
to go
need
either.
to use the chemical rounds. There's nowhere for you to go either. And you want them to leave your boat.
Right.
So this is where I think kinetic rounds are fairly persuasive. They're not wearing a lot of clothes almost in most cruising destinations. They're generally looking to sort of score some, they want to loot your boat a little bit. They're not necessarily they're not hopped up on PCP or something where they don't feel pain. Maybe sometimes they're on speed or something like this. But even then, a few well-placed kinetic rounds, even a few poorly placed kinetic rounds, they might change their mind about whether this is worth dealing with or not. Now, kinetic rounds require a little bit higher degree of accuracy, in my opinion, than a chemical round. A chemical round, you can hit your boat and still get a cloud of deterrent. And I'm sure we'll talk about training and preparation at some point. But in terms of levels of threat, when they're at that point where they're touching your boat, or starting to board your boat, at this point, if it's going south, Byrna chemical rounds, in my opinion, are by far your most effective and least escalationary response that you can deploy. There's another important sort of aspect of this, I think, and that is traditionally people consider the next line of defense to be a firearm. So somebody's in their house, somebody's on their boat, no problem. I'm going to take a firearm and I'm going to shoot them, or I'm going to threaten them with this firearm and have them leave. That has some pretty severe downsides to it. One, you're talking about killing somebody now. You're talking about a person who came on board your boat to steal a fishing pole potentially, and then you see them, you walk out and you end their life. It's not just their life that's going to be affected. You've now taken a life, or you wanted to take a life, intended to, but you hesitated, and now you've escalated the situation to where they feel that their life is threatened. And now your life is really threatened, whereas maybe it wouldn't have been if you hadn't escalated it that way. There's some legal implications. Even in lots of parts in the United States, if you address a potential threat with a vastly disproportionate response, you are at higher legal jeopardy. I'm not a lawyer. People need to look it up for themselves. Then there's this concept of proportionality that is really important in self-defense. And if you're using a Byrna launcher, look, the idea is to have the person leave the boat. If they're there to cause harm, it's to also prevent them from harming you. You very rarely need to kill the person to achieve that. So you can avoid all of these downsides we talked about if you're able to deploy other means. For example, a Byrna launcher with kinetic rounds. You've got some visual deterrent, but much more so they hurt. They don't want to be doing this anymore. This isn't worth it. This isn't fun. I'm going to get off this boat. Most effective.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And man, you made some really good points that, of course, I don't think most of us think about. And then that's look, man, you have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to go. You're in such a limited space. And
get close.
Yeah, and like you said, you can't let them get close. You got to protect that space because now you can't escape. Now at this point it's about keeping them from you rather than giving yourself a window. So that changes the game a lot from what I think most people are traditionally used to when it comes to how they feel about self-defense and walking to and from your car in a parking lot or even in your home. So that's a really good point.
Thank you.
So this is only part of the conversation we got to have with Ryan here on Hot Takes. Stay tuned for part 2 of Hot Takes with Ryan, where we talk about how they are training with their Byrna launchers for self-defense, and they're doing scenario-based training, how they're training on land and both on the boat, moving targets, using the boat, as a self-defense tool itself. So make sure you're subscribing to our YouTube channel and to our podcast, the Hot Take Podcast, on all your major podcasting platforms. platforms so that you can catch part 2 of this episode. I'm telling you right now, you're not going to want to miss it. So much great info. Go down to the link at cruisersafety.info for this training plan and this defense strategy that we're talking about. And we'll see you next time on Hot Takes Part 2 with Ryan, so that the time comes you are prepared to defend.